which is Measure 110 Values Statement. This is a request by the board to come back to you with a draft document which would state the values of the board on Measure 110. Kimberly DeSantis, Senior Policy Advisor in the Board of County Commissioners Office, will be the presenter. She's helped work with multiple staff to come up with the draft, so we're seeking your feedback today. Go ahead, please, Kimberly.
Thank you, Gary, for the introduction. Good morning, Commissioners and Chair. Nice to be before you this morning. So as some background, in November of 2020, there was a Drug Addiction Treatment and Recovery Act that was passed by voters, more commonly known as Measure 110. You've discussed it a lot. It decriminalized personal amounts of controlled substances and shifted some funding towards addiction treatment services. Last year, the board took the opportunity to raise some questions about the effectiveness of Measure 110. This was about June of last year. And you began conversations about some necessary changes. You have not met formally to discuss your position since June of last year, and there has been growing interest across the state to either reform or repeal Measure 110. And this last December, you asked for an opportunity to come together and to discuss your position and to consider something in writing. So before you today, you have a draft values statement that you can utilize, you can modify, you can throw it out and start all over again. It is up to you. The DA was unable to be here today, but we do have representatives from Health, Housing, and Human Services. I believe Mary Rumbaugh is here behind me, and she's available for questions. And with that, I will kick it off to you.
Commissioner West.
You knew I was going to flip my light on, didn't you, Chair? Before I even got there. Thank you, Chair. I'll do my best not to be long-winded. I have a lot of thoughts about this. Just had a very, very productive meeting in Salem all afternoon and most of the day with the majority leader in the Senate, Senator Lieber, who I want to be very clear of much respect for. We are not coming fully eye to eye yet on what this legislature might do, but I want to be very clear that I respect Senator Lieber and enjoy the continuing conversation and being included in that conversation with her as we try to fix this policy. I think it's super important, since we discuss it all the time, that we're very clear in our value statement as a board. One of the big questions is, do we support a full repeal, or do we want to do this significant amendment restructuring of Measure 110? Before I get into all these things specifically about the value statement, I am conflicted. I feel like I waffle, maybe like a lot of Oregonians, with the position we've been put in. I'm just being honest about where I'm at. One, the legislature always had marijuana dollars. It always had alcohol tax dollars and cigarette dollars. It always could have been more purposeful in its effort to address mental health and addiction issues in the state of Oregon. It always could have made it a priority. It chose not to. Measure 110 changed that, and it did change funding sources and then also decriminalized. But the problem I have also with Measure 110 is the premise is that it's a pro-drug measure. In its fundamental core, it's pro-drug. It's easy to get high, and it's still hard to get treatment. That's something in its core that is strong for we just need to repeal and ask the legislature to not abdicate its role. It has more pressure now more than ever. Let's be more effective with rolling out the funding that's always been there. Then we have to trust a legislature that's never shown itself to truly step up and show real leadership in this case and address this crisis. And there's not a lot of confidence, especially from the counties, the League of Oregon Cities, the Sheriff's Association, the DA's Association, a lot of local governments, that even in the short session with the polling the way it is and the outcry from our communities, it just is going to be the appearance of something significant without actually really being significant and rising to the occasion to show the type of leadership we need in a bipartisan way to get it done. So here we are at the question, what's our value statement? And as a county and a leading county and a leading voice in this, are we a full repeal? And then let's get the funding out and let's be recovery oriented in all the things we're doing? Or are we like the Max Williams crew with a potential ballot measure looming that we're all going to be addressing, and more of a, we don't trust the legislature, we need to actually do a full kind of restructure and keep some funding elements in place, but a very significant restructure, I think, is the big question before us. I don't know how you want to handle this, Chair, but I have a
go
lot of
ahead.
thoughts about this document.
Okay,
And I
and-
can jump into my thoughts, or I don't
Yes.
want, I know it's,
Go ahead, and I have some thoughts too, and maybe the other
Okay.
commissioners do too. Commissioner West, go ahead.
this is a really good start, I feel like. Ms. Rumba, I very much value your opinion here on a local perspective. I'm sure you'll be up here in a minute. I really, really want to, actually really want to hear your thoughts on this. I want this to be county, a value statement, which means it can be kind of broad, but I want it from a county's perspective, right? And that's a little unique than a legislator or even the city of Portland, but I think that's kind of my focus. Couple things that I don't see here is, and I think Clackamas County wants to speak to culture around this too. That's like, there's some, in the last few bullet points, it's there. A couple things I don't see is that I feel like Measure 110 almost encouraged and was very permissive with drug culture in Oregon, which I think we're much more permissive and encouraging of drug usage in Oregon than many places. So I think that we need to very much be clear that we don't want a permissive drug culture in Clackamas County. I think we need to be clear about the data we're getting from OHA and the data. It's not about your programs and whether or not using harm reduction, fine. I want us to talk about sobriety. I want to know the data on someone through the care continuum and their journey in sobriety and who's sober. All of the state's goals never talk about sobriety, wholeness, the healing within sobriety. The goal is sobriety. And in Oregon, that's kind of a radical statement because the legislature will not make that statement. It is about sobriety, and we need to make that same, we need data that aligns with a vision of prevention, long-term recovery, and sobriety. There's no real benefit to us to just talk about provided services, but how are people getting sober? And being clear that that's our goal, and we need the data to do that. We are far away from having the type of accountability tools that we need to intervene to get people care. Right now, it looks like the legislative concept from Senator Lieber is they're really pushing a Class C misdemeanor that only gives us 30 days to barely sober somebody up, maybe if they're on fentanyl, if we're being honest about what that intensive treatment looks like, to where we could use the accountability piece of a Class A misdemeanor, which is what the sheriffs, what the DAs, what the League of Oregon Cities, and now it looks like AOC, where we want to have a Class A misdemeanor because it gives us 364 days of potential accountability, with the whole goal is to dismiss that charge, but the goal is to intervene to help people get sober and healed. And we're very far away from what the legislator is willing to move on because of some ideological and politics, but we really need and are begging for bigger accountability. So I think that we should be specific about that within this document. And Measure 110 really did something horrible with kids. Kids aren't adults. And that population should not be treated the same. And it is because of Measure 110. And that's wrong. And I feel like that we should also address that specifically, and that's not in this document. And then one other thing that I'll bring up as that's specific to counties, Measure 110 completely changed the funding, and it did impact local counties and whatnot. So here's Measure 110 cuts services to drug abuse prevention, alcoholism services, programs in cities and counties, and funding for schools and state police by an estimated statewide of $265 million in the recent budget cycle. I think that we should recommend, and our value should be, that to identify these expenditures that funded treatment prior to Measure 110 and restore that back to the local level. There's talk right now that the legislature wants to take, as we are the local health authority, it is our role as the government closest to the people. They want to take funding away and some of our flexibility on the local level to manage that funding and give it back to the state who's further away from the people and allows us to be less nimble and specific and tailored to our population. And Measure 110, we can talk about how that funding source is used, but it did impact counties directly and funding sources prior, and then the rollout of that funding from Measure 110 has been an abysmal failure, and much of it didn't get the treatment. The board that managed that at OHA was inept and incompetent, and it has had a local effect. Now, because we have an amazing, talented staff and could do more with less, we've done that in Clackamas County, but I think that our value statement should speak to the funding impact directly and the local control of counties. I have more on that. I'm sure it will come up, but those are my initial thoughts on this document to address it. I think that this is a good start, and I'm excited. I mean, when I'm in the AOC meeting yesterday, much of the state is looking at us countywide. The other, I would say, 31, 35 other counties in the state are very much looking to us. We're big. We've been competent. Leaders like Mary, we are good at what we do and respected, and even the legislature is talking with us. So I think this value statement's important, and I'm excited that we're close to getting it done.
So Commissioner West, are you going to submit your edits to Kimberly?
I have submitted a lot of edits. I'm not the only voice on this, so some of them some of the things I've already mentioned today have been from staff or whatever, have been already chopped. But it's our document, and I've brought them forward again to see what you guys think. It's our decision.
I do think it's important to talk about the funding cuts, and I see nothing wrong in the value statement that's written today at this point in time, referencing the 263 million cuts statewide. Now, the marijuana dollars, as I understand it, and somebody in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, are really taken out of the county's allocation and put towards Measure 110 facilities. And there's not a lot of those Measure 110 facilities in Clackamas County that I'm aware of. There's
period.
two. Huh?
Or period.
Yeah, well, there's two. One's right on the border, one's on 82nd. So that was, that hurts us. I do think this document needs to address the flow of funds. I also have some edits that I would like to see here. Commissioner Savas, you're up.
Yeah, I'm not as well-versed as Commissioner West is on this, so I appreciate his passion and his interest and knowledge and experience in this area, as I do the experience of our staff as well, all unique experiences. I just want to say big picture, I certainly acknowledge the beginning of your statement, Commissioner, and agree that the alcohol and marijuana monies were specifically supposed to go to this cause, this need from the beginning, prior to 110.
Yep.
So, the question is, for me, how do we maintain that? I won't say in perpetuity, but as long as there's a need out there, right? How do we do that in such a way that a measure does, right? Where it's almost constitutional in a sense, right? It's now a measure, right? So it locks that in. That's a benefit, right? But where I'm confused is where he started out in this conversation as a board with the idea of repealing only, right? And I know right now we're seeing possible reforms, and I don't know what that looks like, and I necessarily don't trust that it's probably going to turn out the way that everyone wants, clearly, because there's different opinions on this, right? So the top of the document says, Clackamas County values on proposed changes to Measure 110, not repeal or replace. And I think that's a question we need to really ask ourselves, right? Because it looks different if it's about throw it out the window and repeal it, right? So I am intrigued by the possibility of maybe getting it right and modifying it in the reform aspect, kind of what you're speaking to. And some of the things that stick out for me are how do we lock in and maybe reforming it because if it secures that funding, that intent of the funding might be a benefit to reform versus repeal, right? How do we, this question of local control versus state control of the monies, I do have some reservations. I don't disagree. The question is, if it's formula-based, let's just say on population, it's not a concern, if it is local. And that way I know that one county is not going to use it all up and at the detriment of other counties that maybe need the funding, right? As they grow into getting the supports and the staffing and the facilities, we're all going to probably, our timing of implementation for the services needed is going to take years, right, to get it all in place. So what I don't know, and maybe some of our staff can tell me, is the funding that is out there today, if it was formula-based on population, is it adequate to meet our needs? Or do we need additional funding? If we need additional funding, then maybe there's another ask in there somewhere that needs to be identified in this. So again, I'm not close to this like you are. I don't have all the answers, but I think that's one thing. The other part is the law enforcement, restoring the law enforcement aspects. I think getting to the supply and getting to the culture where it's okay to do this publicly, which I don't believe it is. So I would like to see the law enforcement aspect done in a way that is appropriate. Certainly, I think that there are examples of maybe it going too far, where going after the suppliers and the higher level crimes is important to restore that, but maybe there is part of reform, like, for example, I might get my citation or my misdemeanor waived if I commit to, a 1 year, a long-term.
Yep.
So I'm supportive of those kind of concepts that work for people. But I think we do need to answer the primary question, which the law says, is it going to be reformed? Do we take an issue of let's reform it so we can lock in maybe, if that is a mutual goal, that long-term funding in perpetuity, or go back to where it was a bucket of money that was robbed for other purposes?
Well, I think that first question is the primary question before we get into the document.
Exactly.
Are we reforming or are we repeal, replace?
Thank you. That's my first.
And it's not an easy question, because the assumption and the premise of Measure 110 is really pro-drug. Like, just distill it down. Now, can we get really aggressive and kind of gut this thing? But it's kind of a false choice to say we have to have Measure 110 to have the funding. That's the argument being made.
And it's a false choice.
And it's kind of a false choice.
Commissioners,
So, yeah.
Ben, we're running up against the clock,
Okay.
and there's commissioners that want to go to a luncheon, I know I do, and 2 commissioners have not spoken yet on
Go
this.
for it.
Okay, Commissioner Scholl, and then I will speak on this.
On this matter of Measure 110, I'd like us to think about erring on the side of families and kids. I read an article just yesterday where a young man was caught selling drugs to some of our K through 12 kids, and that drug pusher got convicted and sent to jail for 2 years. 2 measly years. I'm concerned that this draft, which I appreciate, Kimberly, your work on this, but I don't want us to capitulate to those people in Salem who are going to want to take Measure 110, make a few changes, and then come up with a situation on our streets that is not significantly different than what we see today. And I believe that what we need here is a very strong statement to our state legislature that we demand a situation, a society, in which somebody who is in possession of killer illegal drugs is charged, tried, and convicted, and moved off the street. And that could be to jail, or it could be to a court-mandated treatment, but we cannot have a situation where somebody who is possessed by fentanyl has some sort of say or has the ability to consent to that treatment. In other words, they cannot be allowed to go back on the street, okay? And so again, we need to treat killer drugs, and these are killer drugs. They're killing our people. They're harming our kids, for crying out loud. And treat anybody who possesses, uses, or distributes these killer drugs as a criminal. So again, Mark Scholl says repeal Measure 110, but if we're going to do a document that is going to enable us to parlay with the state legislature, then I would say I want that statement to be a little bit more forceful, that we will not tolerate any more of what Measure 10 has brought to this county and to our streets and to the harm it's done to our families. And number one concern for me is our K through 12 kids. Thank you.
Thank you. The title, why don't we just change the title to Clackamas County Value Statement on Measure 110? Don't have that word changes in there, it doesn't make sense to anybody, okay? You go down to the bulleted points, the first set of bulleted points, the fourth bulleted point says stem the flow. Why not just say eliminate the flow? Stem means nothing to me. You're going to take off 1% of the drugs off the street and therefore, no, eliminate. Going to Commissioner Scholl's point. On the second bullet point on that paragraph, that language does not make sense to me. So that line needs to be rewritten, Kim, and I can help you with that. Thank you very much. So, Commissioners, are we doing this statement to capitulate to the legislature and in anticipation of what we think we're going to do? Or are we doing these value statements on what we believe Clackamas County citizens wants? And you better make up your mind. I'm not interested in capitulating to the legislature, who probably will not do anything close to what we're demanding. What if the signature gathering effort is successful and it's on the ballot, and the vote to totally repeal is successful in the state? How does this make our statement look if we're thinking that we're going to somehow reform that? And those are questions, Commissioners, you have not answered for yourselves. So how can we go forward on a statement? And I think the vote to the citizens is infinitely more important than the vote in the legislature, because frankly, I can see the writing on the wall in the legislature right now. They're listening, they're pandering to us. Oh, good idea, good idea. In the end, they're going to pass what they want. They're not going to have significant change, because guess what? Governor Kotek has not even mentioned Measure 110, ever. They're going to pat us on the head, send us on our way, take our money, and throw us some little measly bone, and it's not going to solve the problem. So I suggest, Kim, that I'm not interested in capitulating whatsoever on this, and we may end up in a deadlock on this if we don't. Now, I'm not going to take any more comments on this right now because, Gary, we have a couple more areas of business we need to take care of, and I'm suggesting at your recommendation that we do those tomorrow.
Yes, we can finish the items on the issues list tomorrow, Wednesday, probably right after the second policy session, but we looked at your calendars, no one has a lunch meeting, but are any of you not going to be here tomorrow morning? Or tomorrow around 11:30 to 12?
Like 11:30 to noon.
Yes.
And if there's time, and if the policy sessions don't take an entire hour, we can come back and revisit this discussion on Measure 110, because I don't think we've had a full discussion that we need on this today. I think, Ben, you have more ideas.
Yep.
You know, Martha's not here to add her opinion on it, and so tomorrow, if we need a further discussion on it, I'm willing to do that. Work into the afternoon a little bit longer.
So I'm going to notice then the remainder of today's issues list and this Measure 110 discussion. We're going to move to tomorrow's, addendum to tomorrow's agenda. We'll start in the morning, and if necessary, we can go into tomorrow afternoon.
That's fine. We'll start tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Okay, all right,
Okay.
got it.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, staff, for showing up. Very nice. We have an important luncheon to attend today. Seeing no further business before this commission, we are adjourned.